What started as a simple property dispute over my backyard pool turned into the most twisted legal battle I never saw coming. Karen Thompson thought she owned my property, my peace of mind, and apparently my entire life. But when I set up security cameras to catch her trespassing, I discovered something so shocking that it would tear apart our entire neighborhood and expose a conspiracy that went straight to the top of our homeowners association. This is the true story of how one woman's obsession with my swimming pool nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for. My name is David Chen, and 3 years ago I thought I'd found paradise. When I bought my dream home at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, the house came with everything I'd ever wanted: a spacious backyard, mature oak trees, and most importantly, a beautiful in-ground pool that sparkled like a sapphire in the California sun. I'd saved for 15 years to afford this slice of suburban heaven, working double shifts at the engineering firm just to make the down payment. But paradise has a way of turning into hell when you least expect it. It started innocently enough. Karen Thompson lived 3 houses down in the biggest McMansion on the block. She was the kind of woman who wore tennis skirts to grocery stores and spoke to service workers like they were personally inconveniencing her by existing as the self-appointed president of our homeowners association. Karen had appointed herself the unofficial sheriff of Maple Ridge Drive. The first time I caught her in my pool, I thought it was a mistake. I came home from work on a sweltering Tuesday in July to find her floating on a pink inflatable swan, sipping what looked like a mimosa from a champagne flute. My pool, my backyard, my property. "Excuse me," I called out, still in my work clothes, sweat beading on my forehead. "What are you doing?" Karen didn't even look embarrassed. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and took another sip of her drink. "Oh, David, there you are. I was just cooling off. This heat is absolutely dreadful, don't you think? This is my pool." "Karen, on my property," she laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of broken glass. "Don't be silly. According to the HOA bylaws, all recreational facilities within the community boundaries are subject to reasonable shared usage among residents in good standing." I stared at her, my mouth hanging open. "That's not how property ownership works. This pool is on my deed." "Well," she said, paddling her swan toward the shallow end, "perhaps you should review the community guidelines more carefully. I helped write them, you know." That night, I pulled out every document from my home purchase. I read through the whole agreement 3 times, searched online, even called my real estate agent. There was absolutely nothing about shared pool usage. Karen was lying, and she knew it. But Karen Thompson wasn't the type to back down from a lie. Over the next 2 months, her visits became a routine. I come home to find her entertaining guests in my backyard, her book club using my pool chairs, her grandchildren splashing in my deep end while she supervised from my patio furniture. Each time I confronted her, she'd reference some made-up HOA rule or community guideline that supposedly gave her the right. The aesthetic enhancement clause clearly states that underutilized amenities should be made available for community wellness. She'd say, or the neighborhood harmony provision requires all residents to share resources during peak summer months. I started documenting everything: photos, timestamps, even recordings of our conversations. But every complaint I filed with the HOA was mysteriously dismissed or lost. When I tried to call the police, they told me it was a civil matter that needed to be handled through proper channels. Karen was always one step ahead. The breaking point came on Labor Day weekend. I planned a small party for my college friends who were visiting from out of state. I'd spent 2 days preparing, buying food, cleaning the pool area, setting up speakers and lights. This was supposed to be my moment to finally enjoy the paradise I'd worked so hard to afford. When my friends and I walked into the backyard with platters of food, we found Karen hosting what looked like a block party. There had to be 30 people in my pool and scattered across my patio. Kids were doing cannonballs on my diving board, while adults lounged in every piece of outdoor furniture I own. "Karen, what the hell is this?" I shouted over the music she'd apparently brought with a portable DJ setup. She emerged from the pool house, My pool house, wearing a hostess smile and a red, white, and blue bikini that left very little to the imagination. David, perfect timing. I was just telling everyone about our wonderful community spirit here at Maple Ridge. Everyone needs to leave. Now, this is my property. The music stopped. 30 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like I just announced I was canceling Christmas. Karen's expression shifted from fake sweetness to something much darker. I don't think so, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet yard. You see, David, I've done some research into your little property purchase. There seem to be some discrepancies with your lot boundaries. Some very interesting discrepancies. My blood went cold. What are you talking about? Karen smiled. Well, it wasn't friendly anymore. It was predatory. I think we need to have a proper survey done. Until then, I'm afraid this area remains in dispute. For everyone's safety, of course. That's when I noticed the man in the suit standing by my gate. He walked over with an official-looking document and handed it to me, with the kind of professional courtesy that immediately makes your stomach drop. David Chen, you're being served. This is notice of a property dispute filed with the county clerk's office. You have 30 days to respond. As I read the papers with shaking hands, Karen's party resumed around me. The music started up again. People went back to swimming in my pool, and my college friends stood there in awkward silence, still holding platters of food that suddenly seemed ridiculous. The lawsuit claimed that my property survey was fraudulent, that I'd been trespassing on community land for 3 years, and that Karen Thompson, as HOA president, had the legal authority to reclaim the disputed area for community use until the matter could be properly resolved. My dream home had just become my nightmare, and Karen Thompson was just getting started. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the legal papers that had turned my life upside down. Outside my window, I could see Karen doing laps in my pool like she owned the place, which, according to her lawsuit, she might actually believe she did. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the predatory smile and heard her voice saying interesting discrepancies. What discrepancies? My property survey had been done by a licensed professional. I had title insurance. I had a deed. How could any of this be in dispute? By 9 a.m., I was sitting across from Margaret Reeves, the only real estate attorney in town who could see me on short notice. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. This is highly unusual, she said, flipping through Karen's filing. Property disputes like this are typically resolved long before someone moves in and lives somewhere for 3 years. What exactly happened during your original purchase? I walked her through everything. The inspection, the survey, the title search. It had all seemed routine at the time. The surveyor was recommended by my real estate agent, James Morrison from Morrison Land Services. Margaret made a note. We'll need to contact him immediately. In the meantime, I'm going to request an emergency hearing. Karen can't just claim your property and start using it while the case is pending. But when Margaret called Morrison Land Services, we got our first shock. The business had been dissolved 6 months after my home purchase. James Morrison had moved to Nevada and wasn't returning calls. The phone number on my survey documents was disconnected. This smells wrong, Margaret said, her expression growing grim. I'm going to need you to do something, and you're not going to like it. What? Install security cameras. Good ones. If Karen is this brazen about using your property, I have a feeling she's not going to stop just because we filed a counter motion. We need to document everything that we can. I spent $1,200 on a professional security system, 8 cameras with night vision, motion sensors, and cloud storage. I positioned them to cover every angle of my backyard, pool area, and the property line Karen was claiming to dispute. It felt like turning my dream home into a prison, but I didn't have a choice. The cameras started recording on Monday morning. By Wednesday, I had footage that made my stomach turn. Karen wasn't just using my pool during the day when I was at work. She was hosting parties, selling pool memberships to other neighbors for $50 a month, and had even hired a pool maintenance company to service what she was calling the community aquatic facility. But the real shock came when I reviewed Friday night's footage at 11:47 p.m. Long after I'd gone to bed, Karen let herself into my backyard using a key, not picking the lock, not climbing the fence. She had an actual key to my gate. She walked directly to my pool house and retrieved what looked like documents from a storage container I didn't even know existed. I called Margaret immediately. "She has keys to your property." Margaret's voice was sharp with disbelief, apparently. "And she's storing documents in my pool house. Documents I've never seen. David, I need you to check your property deed again. Look at the plot map very carefully. Compare it to what you can see from your windows." I spread my deed documents across my kitchen table and looked out at my backyard. According to the official plot map, my property line should extend 15 feet beyond where my current fence stood. But I'd never questioned the fence placement because it was already there when I bought the house. "Margaret, according to this, my property is actually bigger than I thought. The fence isn't on the property line." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "David, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this isn't just about your pool. This might be about something much bigger." That Sunday, Margaret and I met at my house to walk the actual property boundaries according to my deed. Armed with a measuring tape and the official survey, we discovered that my legal property line extended not just beyond my current fence, but into what I'd always assumed was community common area, including the gazebo where the HOA held monthly meetings, and the community mailbox cluster, and the small playground that serviced half the neighborhood. "Jesus Christ," Margaret whispered as we stood at the playground, "if your deed is accurate, the HOA has been holding meetings and maintaining community facilities on your private property for years." "But that's impossible." Karen would have known. Margaret's expression was grim. Karen would have absolutely known. She's been the HOA president for 8 years. She would have been intimately familiar with every property boundary in this neighborhood. That's when it hit me. The dissolved surveying company, the forged property lines, Karen's immediate access to my pool house, and her mysterious key to my gate. This wasn't a property dispute at all. This was a cover-up. And I was about to find out just how deep it went. Margaret's phone rang. She answered it with a sharp breeze as she listened. Her face grew pale. "That was my paralegal," she said after hanging up. "Karen Thompson just filed an emergency motion claiming you've been harassing her and demanding that you be temporarily barred from your own property pending the outcome of the dispute." The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. In less than 48 hours, I might be locked out of my own home while Karen continued to host pool parties in my backyard. But I had security footage, property documents, and a real estate attorney who was starting to get angry. Karen Thompson might have thought she held all the cards, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my home. Monday morning arrived like a hangover after a nightmare. I sat in courtroom 3B of the county courthouse, watching Karen Thompson enter with what looked like half the neighborhood trailing behind her. She transformed herself into the picture of suburban respectability: navy blue suit, pearls, and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Judge Patricia Hammond was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on a Monday morning. Karen's attorney, Robert Sterling, was exactly the kind of slick corporate lawyer you'd expect someone like Karen to hire. Expensive suit, perfect hair, and the kind of confident smile that suggested he thought this case was already won. "Your Honor," Sterling began, rising with theatrical precision, "my client, Mrs. Karen Thompson, has served this community faithfully as HOA president for 8 years. She discovered, through careful research and documentation, that Mr. Chen has been illegally occupying community property and excluding rightful homeowners from accessing shared facilities." I felt my jaw clench as Sterling continued his opening statement, painting me as some kind of property-grabbing villain who'd been deceiving my neighbors for years. According to his version of events, I was a selfish newcomer who'd somehow tricked the system and was now trying to steal community resources from families who lived here for decades. Furthermore, Your Honor, Mr. Chen has recently escalated this dispute by installing surveillance equipment clearly intended to intimidate and harass Mrs. Thompson and other community members who are simply trying to exercise their legal rights. Judge Hammond looked at me over her reading glasses. Mr. Chen, you're representing yourself today. No, Your Honor. Margaret Reeves will be representing me. Margaret stood, and I immediately felt better. If Sterling looked like a corporate shark, Margaret looked like the kind of attorney who ate corporate sharks for breakfast. Your Honor, what we have here isn't a property dispute. It's a fraud that has been perpetrated against my client for 3 years, and possibly against this entire community for much longer. Sterling's confident smile flickered for just a moment. Margaret continued, Mrs. Thompson claims, my client has been occupying community property, but according to the official deed filed with this county, the property in question, including the pool, the gazebo, and several other community facilities, belongs entirely to Mr. Chen. That's preposterous, Karen whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Judge Hammond's gavel came down once. Mrs. Thompson, you'll have your chance to speak. Margaret approached the bench with a stack of documents. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Mr. Chen's original property deed, title insurance policy, and the survey conducted by Morrison Land Services at the time of purchase. Sterling was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The survey conducted by Morrison Land Services has been called into question. We have evidence that the surveyor was not properly licensed and the measurements were fraudulent. Evidence. Margaret's voice was sharp. What evidence? Sterling produced his own folder. We have a sworn affidavit from James Morrison himself, stating that he was pressured by Mr. Chen to falsify property boundaries. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. James Morrison, the surveyor who disappeared to Nevada, had apparently resurfaced with a statement claiming I bribed him to lie about my property lines. Margaret looked at me with raised eyebrows. I shook my head frantically. I'd never even spoken to Morrison except for basic pleasantries during the survey. Your Honor, Margaret said, I'd like to request a brief recess to examine this alleged affidavit. Granted. 15 minutes. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Margaret spread Sterling's documents across a bench. This is dated last week, she said, pointing to Morrison's signature. Convenient timing. Margaret, I swear to you, I never spoke to that man about anything other than where to measure. I believe you, but we need proof. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling my investigator. If Morrison is lying, there might be a paper trail. When we returned to the courtroom, Sterling was ready with what he clearly thought was his winning argument. Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson has been forced to take action not just because of Mr. Chen's illegal occupation of community property, but because of his recent escalation in harassment and intimidation. Sterling clicked a remote, and a large screen descended behind the judge's bench. These are photographs taken by community members of the extensive surveillance system Mr. Chen installed, clearly designed to spy on and intimidate neighbors who are simply trying to enjoy community facilities they have every right to use. The photos showed my security cameras from every possible angle, making them look like something out of a prison yard rather than reasonable home protection. Furthermore, Sterling continued, Mr. Chen has been verbally aggressive toward Mrs. Thompson and other community members, including threatening to call police on families with children who were simply cooling off during the recent heat wave. I wanted to stand up and scream. He was making me sound like some kind of monster who threatened children and spied on neighbors for fun. But Margaret had told me to stay calm, and I trusted her. Your Honor, Margaret said when it was her turn, I'd like to call Mr. Chen to testify about the installation of his security system. I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs. Margaret's questions were straightforward. Why did I install the cameras? What did I hope to accomplish? Had I ever threatened anyone? But when Sterling cross-examined me, he was ruthless. "Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you became obsessed with Mrs. Thompson's presence in what you mistakenly believed was exclusively your property? I became concerned about trespassing, yes. Obsessed enough to spend over $1,000 on surveillance equipment. I wanted to document what was happening. Document Mrs. Thompson specifically. Document anyone who was using my property without permission." Sterling smiled like he'd just proven his point. "So you admit you were surveilling Mrs. Thompson?" Before I could answer, Margaret was on her feet. "Objection. Mr. Chen was surveilling his own property, alleged property," Sterling corrected. Judge Hammond looked tired. "Let's move this along." That's when Margaret played her ace. "Your Honor, I'd like to show the court some of the footage Mr. Chen's security system captured." Sterling immediately objected, but Judge Hammond overruled him. The screen behind the bench flickered to life, and suddenly we were all watching Karen let herself into my backyard with a key at nearly midnight. The courtroom went dead silent as we watched Karen retrieve documents from my pool house, documents that clearly belonged to her, not to me. "Your Honor," Margaret said quietly, "this footage raises some very serious questions about Mrs. Thompson's claims." Karen's face had gone white. Sterling was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly trying to find an explanation for what we'd all just witnessed. But Margaret wasn't done. "I'd also like the court to see this." The screen showed Karen selling pool memberships to neighbors, cash changing hands right in my backyard. And this, Karen hosting what was clearly a business meeting in my pool house, using community HOA funds to pay for pool maintenance on my private property. Judge Hammond's expression had shifted from tired irritation to sharp attention. "Mrs. Thompson, would you care to explain why you have a key to Mr. Chen's property and why you appear to be conducting business on his premises?" Karen stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking. "Your Honor, there's been a misunderstanding." That's when Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her entire expression changed. "Your Honor, I've just received some additional information that I believe is crucial to this case. My investigator has discovered that James Morrison, the surveyor who allegedly signed the affidavit claiming Mr. Chen pressured him to falsify boundaries, died in a car accident in Nevada 3 months ago." The courtroom exploded. Sterling jumped to his feet. Karen sank into her chair, and Judge Hammond's gavel came down repeatedly. "The affidavit presented by the plaintiff appears to have been signed by a dead man," Margaret announced, "which raises the question of who actually forged Mr. Morrison's signature, and what else might be fraudulent in this case." Sterling's face had gone ashen. Karen looked like she might be sick. Judge Hammond stared at the chaos in her courtroom for a long moment, then looked directly at Karen. Double quotes, "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you have an explanation for why you have keys to property that belongs to Mr. Chen? Why you appear to be conducting business on his premises? And why your attorney just presented what appears to be a forged document to this court?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors burst open and 2 men in dark suits walked down the aisle. "Your Honor," one of them called out, "I'm Agent Rodriguez with the FBI. We have a warrant for the arrest of Karen Thompson on charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." The courtroom erupted in chaos as Karen was handcuffed right there at the plaintiff's table. But as they led her away, she turned back and looked directly at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, David," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've started." As the FBI agents escorted Karen out of the courtroom, I realized that everything I thought I knew about this case was about to change. The courtroom fell silent after Karen was led away in handcuffs, leaving behind only the echo of her final threat and the stunned faces of my neighbors, who'd come to support what they thought was a simple property dispute. Judge Hammond sat behind her bench looking like she'd just witnessed something that belonged in a crime novel, rather than a civil courtroom. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Hammond said, her voice cutting through the silence, "I'm dismissing this case immediately. Furthermore, I'm referring your presentation of what appears to be a forged document to the State Bar for investigation. Sterling gathered his papers with shaking hands and hurried out of the courtroom without another word. Judge Hammond turned to Margaret and me. Mr. Chen, I'm granting you immediate and permanent injunctive relief. Mrs. Thompson and any associates are permanently barred from your property. You have my apologies for what you've been put through. As we walked out of the courthouse, Margaret put her hand on my shoulder. David, I need you to understand something. This case was never about your pool. Karen wasn't some crazy neighbor who got obsessed with your backyard. This was much bigger. 3 days later, Agent Rodriguez called and asked if I could meet him at the FBI field office. The conference room felt like something out of a TV show. Whiteboards covered with photos, documents, and red string connecting various pieces of evidence. Mr. Chen, your property dispute helped us crack open the largest HOA fraud scheme we've ever investigated in this region, Rodriguez explained. Karen Thompson wasn't just stealing your pool access. She's been systematically defrauding homeowners across 6 different communities for over a decade. The scope of what Rodriguez showed me was breathtaking. Karen had been working with corrupt surveyors, title companies, and even county clerks to manipulate property boundaries and steal land from unsuspecting homeowners. She'd then use her positions as HOA president to legitimize her theft, charging other residents for access to community facilities that were actually located on stolen private property. Your pool was just the latest target, Rodriguez continued, but Karen made a mistake with you. Most of her previous victims were elderly or didn't have the resources to fight back. You documented everything and hired a good attorney. What about James Morrison, the surveyor? Rodriguez pulled out a thick file. Morrison was Karen's inside man. He'd create fraudulent surveys showing property lines in completely wrong locations. Then Karen would use those surveys to claim community ownership of private property. When you started investigating, they panicked. Morrison really is dead, but he died trying to flee the country with over $2 million in cash. So the affidavit, forged by Karen herself, we found the fake letterhead and practiced signatures in her home office. As Rodriguez continued explaining the scheme, I realized that my entire neighborhood had been built on a foundation of lies. The community gazebo, the playground, even the mailbox clusters. All of it had been constructed on private property that Karen had systematically stolen from individual homeowners through fraudulent surveys and forged documents. How many people were affected? Across all 6 communities, over 300 families. We estimate the total value of stolen property at over $50 million. My head was spinning. I thought I was fighting to protect my swimming pool, but I'd accidentally uncovered one of the largest real estate fraud schemes in state history. But Agent Rodriguez wasn't finished with his revelations. Mr. Chen, there's one more thing you need to know. Karen Thompson isn't her real name. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a woman who looked exactly like my neighbor, but about 15 years younger, standing next to a man in an expensive suit. Her real name is Catherine Morrison. She was married to your surveyor. This entire operation was a family business. The room started spinning. Catherine Morrison, the surveyor who'd faked my property boundaries, was Karen's husband. They'd been planning to steal my property from the moment I walked into that house 3 years ago. But why my property specifically? There are bigger houses in the neighborhood. Rodriguez smiled grimly. Check the original deed for your property more carefully, Mr. Chen. Look at the previous owner, Margaret, who'd been quietly listening. Pulled out the paperwork from my home purchase. We looked at these documents a dozen times during the legal battle, but now Rodriguez was pointing to something we'd missed. The previous owner, listed on the original deed from 1987, was Harold Thompson, Karen's father-in-law. Rodriguez explained. He sold your property to a developer in 1995, but Karen and James had been planning to steal it back for years. Your house was built on land that Karen believed should have stayed in her family. So this was personal, completely personal. You didn't just buy a house, David. You unknowingly bought into a decades-old family revenge scheme. 6 months later, I was sitting by my pool, my actual, legally confirmed, permanently protected pool, watching the sunset reflect off the water. The FBI investigation had resulted in 17 arrests across 6 states. Karen, or Catherine, had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The HOA had been dissolved and reformed with completely new leadership. Most importantly, every property owner in all 6 affected communities had their correct property boundaries legally restored. My neighbors, who had initially supported Karen in court, had apologized profusely when they learned the truth. Several of them had discovered their own properties were larger than they'd ever known. Margaret stopped by that evening with a bottle of champagne. "So what are you going to do with all that extra land?" she asked, gesturing toward the area where the community gazebo used to stand. I looked out at my property, all of it, including the sections I had never known I owned, and smiled. "I think I'm going to build a bigger pool." Margaret laughed. "After everything you've been through, you want a bigger pool?" "No," I said, opening the champagne. "I want to build a community pool. A real one this time. One where neighbors can actually enjoy swimming together without anyone having to lie, cheat, or steal, as we toasted to justice and new beginnings." I realized that Karen Thompson had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. When she was led away in handcuffs, but not in the way she'd meant, her fraud scheme was over. Her reign of terror over innocent homeowners was over. And her family's decades-old revenge plot was definitely over. What wasn't over was my commitment to making sure something like this never happened to anyone else. I'd already started working with the FBI to develop new protocols for detecting HOA fraud. My security footage had become training material for property fraud investigations. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's making sure the people who tried to destroy your life end up making the world a better place by accident. And sometimes justice really does come with a swimming pool. If you enjoyed this true crime legal drama, subscribe for more incredible stories of ordinary people who fought back against fraud and won. Have you ever dealt with HOA drama or property disputes? Share your story in the comments below. You never know when your experience might help someone else avoid becoming a victim